Hey guys, Kenna here. Today we're going to be looking at freshwater pollution. So we've talked about a variety of different topics related to water and dealing with the fact that, where does it come from, the difference between groundwater, surface water, between fresh water and salt water. And we've talked a little bit about the things that humans have done to try and increase the availability of fresh water. Now, today we're going to talk a little bit about the things humans do that cause pollution to the water, as well as starting to look at how pollution impacts the water system, its availability, and these types of things. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Essential questions for today. Number one, what are the differences between point and non-point pollution? So those are going to be two key vocabulary words as we go ahead and study water. Number two, what are the three classifications of pollution and which is the most common in rivers, in lakes, and in groundwater? And then three, do rivers, lakes, or groundwater self-clean more quickly and why? So I guess we should go ahead and start by just kind of talking about the fact that when we talk about pollution, there's really two ways to go about it. You can either prevent it or you can clean it up. And far and away, the best way to reduce water pollution is to never let it happen in the first place. Okay, so people can use natural methods to treat sewage, to cut resource use, to reduce poverty, to slow population growth. And these are all good things to go ahead and help reduce water pollution. But reducing water pollution requires working with nature because nature, our planet, has its own water treatment facilities, its own ability to go ahead and purify and clean the water in the water cycle. So the way this works in nature depends on the type of water body that you're dealing with. Is it a river? Is it a lake? Is it a stream? Is it a reservoir? Is it the groundwater? And so we need to kind of make sure we understand how those are different and how we can accumulate and deal with those kinds of pollution. So in streams, lakes, rivers, reservoirs, groundwater, water pollution is basically water quality changes that harm living organisms or make the water unfit for drinking, irrigation, and recreation. So the things that happen to the water's quality that make it unusable. The leading causes of water pollution are agriculture. That's a huge one if you think about all of the fertilizer and pesticides that we discussed in our food unit. Industrial facilities using it for various different production processes, and mining in terms of stripping away of non-renewable resources, especially things like fossil fuel, which we'll go ahead and talk about in our next term. So where do these things come from? Well, very broadly, we go ahead and categorize them into two groups: point sources and non-point sources. Point sources are those things that we can identify coming from a very specific location. So the discharge is a very specific location, which makes it easier to identify, to monitor, and to regulate. So in terms of governments or other governing bodies being able to monitor and penalize or levy some sort of impact on those companies that do pollute, point source is pretty easy. The much more difficult one is what we call non-point sources. And the reason this is more difficult because it's much broader. It's not coming from one pipe dumping into a river, that type of thing, but it's very broad and diffuse, accumulating over several miles or coming from multiple sites. And when we start looking at air pollution, okay, especially as we get into fossil fuels and stuff, we'll talk about this same sort of thing because we have point source and non-point sources of pollution. Okay. Runoff, chemicals and sediment. So we start thinking about everything from feedlots, if it's not easily identified to a specific one, the accumulation of these types of things from multiple different feedlots, or from fertilizer from things like agriculture or pesticides, like you see in that next bullet. This can be much more difficult to identify and control, and as such, it's also much more expensive to manage and regulate. Not only do we separate water pollution based on how easy it is to identify where it came from, but we also do it based on what type of pollution we're dealing with. We typically go ahead and start looking at classification in one of several categories. The first of which is what we identify as biological pollution. This is pollution that comes from pathogens, right? Bacteria, viruses, other, protists or other such organisms that make us sick, typically due to poor sanitation. Other things that we can start looking at are invasive species. Things like weeds can cause biological pollution. Eutrophication, we'll talk a little bit about dead zones a little bit later on, but these types of things fall into the biological pollution. The next is what we call physical pollution. Now, physical pollution, typically when we start looking at temperature changes, water in nature should function at a particular temperature based on the climate, based on the season. But sometimes we end up seeing that water gets used as a coolant for things like nuclear power plants or some sort of production process at a factory. And if that water gets discharged into a body of water, there may not be visible, right, pollutants in terms of like all the sludge that's getting dumped into a particular waterway you may have seen in movies, but it can be a huge harm to species like fish and other organisms that live in that body of water if the temperature is out of its normal conditions. We can also look at siltation. So, this is when we start looking at physical particles being disturbed in terms of how they're being dumped, water flow. We can get this from huge disasters like flooding, these types of things as well. But humans can also go ahead and cause this, where we have increased erosion due to destruction of riparian zones. And so we're seeing a decrease in the number of plant species along the river's edge to go ahead and protect the soil, to keep it in place, and you wash that downstream. Now, eventually it may land in a delta and be useful, but for those at that particular point in the stream, it can actually damage the stream a lot and make that stream more susceptible to further damage further on down the road. But that accumulation of material, if deposited in the wrong places, can be uh, not great for the environment as well. And number three, chemical pollution. And this is the one we typically think about when we think of water pollution. This is that sludge being kind of dumped into the water, some chemical plant releasing materials, that type of thing. And this typically is going to go ahead and cause certain amount of toxicity when we start looking at the quality of the water. So, and I've attached this next slide, so you don't have to get it all here, but I've attached this slide to the post so you can kind of take a look at it. These are the major water pollutants that we typically identify and their sources. So you can see that first group, that's the biological pathogens, infectious agents, bacteria, viruses, protozoa, parasites, and typically come from humans or other animals, either their waste or decaying carcasses, these types of things. Okay. Oxygen demanding wastes. These are also problems that oftentimes can come from biological pollutants. Um, so as animal waste break down or plant debris takes a long time to decompose sometimes, you can start seeing an increase in water needing oxygen because of the process of the decomposition of these materials. You can start looking at plant nutrients. These can cause major growth of things like algae, which block sunlight and go ahead and deplete oxygen levels, nitrates, phosphates. These typically come from fertilizers and are a big problem when we start looking at agricultural settings, but these can also come from sewage and animal waste. We have our organic chemicals. This is what you see in most of the movies when we start thinking about petroleum products, oil, gasoline, pesticides, cleaning solvents, these being dumped into rivers and lakes, etc. This is typically from industry, households, farms. Inorganic chemicals, same sort of thing, acids, bases, metal compounds, also from households and industry, but you get some of these from surface runoff as well. Sediments. This is your soil, your silt. This is because of land erosion, often from things like poor farming or poor ranching practices, leading to degradation of the riparian zone right around the river. And we see a decline in the overall health of the waterway. Heavy metals, lead, mercury, arsenic. I think I gave you guys an example before. If not, it'll come up again when we go talk about the ocean. But when we were looking at biomagnification, um, the increase in mercury as it goes up the food chain can cause major problems. Unlined landfills, household chemicals, mining refuse, industrial discharges. And then thermal is heat. Electrical power and industrial plants are good examples of that. So, how can we reduce non point sources of surface water pollution? Well, the first thing we can start looking at is reducing soil erosion by keeping cropland covered with vegetation. So, we want to do crop rotation, we want to do polyculture, we want to make sure that we're not doing these industrial monoculture systems because then they require a bunch of inputs and they tend to degrade the quality of the soil and it ends up being eroded away, these types of things. Uh, One of the things we can do is use slow release fertilizer and not use fertilizer at all if we're going to use it on steep sloped land, because then it's easier for it to run off and end up finding its way into these bodies of water or waterways. Okay, plant vegetation, buffer zones between cultivated fields and nearby surface waters. You saw those examples of alley cropping before to help reduce soil erosion. This is a great example of that. Okay, it can also go ahead and prevent fertilizers from getting down to our bodies of water as they get absorbed by the vegetation, which isn't always good, but probably better than in the waterway. If we can move towards a more sustainable organic farming system, because there are fewer inputs, we're going to have less runoff because we're following practices that do polycultures, that are going to go ahead and do rotation cropping. You're less likely to have bare soil that's going to go ahead and lead to increases in soil erosion. Okay. Um, what else can we do? Remember that most of this is agricultural waste. And if we go ahead and look at these types of agroecology systems that rely on sustainability, working with nature, you decrease the number of inputs needed, and you're constantly putting a variety of different crops on the soil, which reduces soil erosion, reduces fertilizer use. And by planting things like the alley cropping areas, you can go ahead and minimize um, the runoff that gets into the water bodies, whether that's from fields because of your animals, or whether or not it's some sort of pesticide or something that we do may end up having to use in a particular field. We can keep our feedlots away from slopes, surface waters, flood zones. Have an integrated pest management plan that helps us to reduce the need for fertilizers and pesticides as much as possible by working with organic farming methods and trying to work with nature. And there are some laws that have gone into place to help make all these things possible. The Clean Water Act, the Water Quality Act, and these are going to go ahead and help us deal with the amount of pollution that we as humans go ahead and put into nature. However, there are still some controversies surrounding cap and trade policies where a certain company sells their extra pollution credits to another company so that that company can over pollute and these types of things. We're not going to spend much time on those here, but it is something of note to go ahead and investigate if you're interested in learning more about how law is dealing with water pollution in particular. So let's give you a case study. Um, when we start looking at point sources, now remember those are the easier ones to identify and regulate. What have we done? We've had actually pretty impressive achievements since 1972. You can think about what else was going on at those times, maybe give you an idea of why this was such a big deal. Um, because of the laws you saw on the previous page, you see regulation, you see some steps being taken to improve the overall health of the water system and to reduce the amount of water pollution being introduced. Okay, time for the bad news. In a 2006 survey, 45% of lakes and 40% of streams were too polluted for fishing or swimming, meaning that we as humans couldn't eat the fish out of them and couldn't go swimming in them without risking getting sick or ill. We have runoff polluting 7 out of every 10 rivers. So 70% of all of our rivers are suffering from fertilizer or pesticide runoff that's causing problems with the pH and overall chemical makeup of the water. Fish caught in 1/4, 25% of all the waterways in the United States have fish in them that is considered unsafe or unhealthy to go ahead and eat. And one thing that they've noticed that's been on the rise lately is that gas storage tanks, and there are 10,000s of them, are leaking. And some of that petroleum based material is leaking into our water sources and contaminating our surface waters. Flowing streams and rivers use a combination of dilution and bacterial biodegradation to naturally eliminate waste, but this is a slow process and it does not work when overloaded with pollutants. Historically, we've seen this kind of overload from industrial wastewater discharge, and we see a similar thing when we're looking at lower flows due to drought, damming, or diversion. So here's another potential problem with some of the dams we talked about, maybe up on the Snake. Hopefully, we don't have too much pollution, but the dams are going to limit the amount of self cleaning that the river can go ahead and do. Bacterial decomposition depletes the dissolved oxygen in the water, making it less healthy for the fish and other organisms that live there. This eliminates populations of high oxygen using organisms until the stream is cleaned. And so that process has to take place, and the longer it takes to take place, the less healthy the stream becomes. So this gives you kind of a flow chart of what we start looking at. You'll notice that we have a point source of some pollution here, and it's dumping in. We have normal clean water above that. You see your bass and these healthy fish. But then you start dealing with a change in the populations in the river or a stream at this point. As the pollution begins to sink and mix with the rest of the water, you have this zone known as the decomposition zone, which has pollution tolerant fish like carp, gar, these types of things. And if the only type of fish you're catching in a particular waterway is some sort of bottom feeder, catfish, these types of things, carp, that probably does not speak too well to the overall health of that waterway at the point where you're fishing. Then you'll get to what's known as the septic zone. This is the worst area. The fish are typically not there. You have fungi, sludge, some worms, bacteria. This is mostly anaerobic, so it's mostly no oxygen available for things. Then you start seeing a recovery zone, which is going to go ahead and start having your pollution tolerant fish, again, carp, gar, these types of things, before the stream is able to kind of dilute the pollutant to a point where it's not causing huge problems. And you start seeing your trout, your perch, your bass, mayflies, stoneflies, these types of things in those areas. So, one of the biggest takeaways that I hope you have from today is that streams can cleanse themselves of many, I mean many pollutants. But that's only possible if we don't overload them or reduce their flows. And from your reading on Apocalypse River, from what we saw in the video about the um, Snake River and looking at the dams on it, hopefully you're realizing that if we're going to allow the streams to cleanse themselves and use that ecosystem service, we have to leave enough water in it for it to be able to flow. Now, one of the biggest, I would say, disasters in terms of human pollution of our waterways probably is known as the Cuyahoga River fire. Yeah, you heard that right, fire. This is a point where the river itself actually caught flame. Now, we don't usually think of rivers being aflame because of, well, water puts out fire. But I have a little video that's going to go over how this happened and what this means in terms of the overall health of the river. Enjoy.
And we all know about the river fire of '69. And as somebody who's interested in the history of Cleveland and Cuyahoga River, I know that wasn't the best fire. I know there was other fires that could have burned down Cleveland had not the wind shifted from the north. I remember a '52 fire. I think that one probably would have won the prize for the best fire. I was actually working the day that the river caught on fire, actually working as a hatch tender on the ships. So it's kind of unusual when somebody would yell fire and tell you to run away from the river, because the river is generally water. But when you were working down on the river at that time, the river was like a cauldron. It would just bubble up, oxygen trying to get out of the river. It had a coat of oil on it. And you'd see rats float down the river the size of dogs, bloated from whatever it was that they ingested. And there was a rule that if you fell in the river, you immediately went to the emergency room in the hospital. So the idea here was don't fall in the river.
Can you imagine that? Can you imagine a river where don't fall in the river because it's more dangerous in case of a fire than running away from it? Now, when it comes to rivers, individuals matter. You matter because at this level, all sustainability is local. Caring for our local rivers requires stewardship, and it starts with you. How do you care for it? How do you use the water? What do you put into the water? If you're using it for recreation, making sure that we don't have oil spills, making sure that we don't allow trash to build up in our waterways, that we don't put it there in the first place. One of the biggest things I can tell students to kind of help when we start thinking about pollution of water, when you go out to your curb, water, if you water your truck or wash your car, that sort of thing, when you go ahead and finish that, where does that water go? Now, in most cases, people will tell me, oh, it goes down the gutter. Well, where does the gutter go? Well, it goes to a little drain. And then where does the drain go? In Oregon and many other states, that drain runs into the bodies of water that are surrounding us. So anything that goes in that gutter ends up going down the drain and into our waterways. And for us, especially when we start thinking about the Mackenzie, the Willamette, these are the bodies of water that provide us with our drinking water. So we have to think extra hard about the things that we're putting into those drains because unlike the drains inside your house that may go to a water treatment plant before they're discharged, as long as there's no flooding or anything, into our waterways, uh, a lot of those drains go straight into our waterways, and you'll actually see a little emblem or something that has like a fish just to kind of remind you about what happens there. Now, when we started looking at that, the contamination and how the rivers and streams can go ahead and self clean by diluting the pollutant out and then having it worked out of the system, how does that work for lakes and rivers? Okay. Lakes and reservoir, not rivers, lakes and reservoirs. Lakes and reservoirs have much lower flow rates. The water is not moving as fast, so it takes longer for it to dilute. And as such, they typically have stratified layers in them, making them less effective at self cleaning. So, near urban and agricultural areas, chemical runoff, pesticides, fertilizer, etc., causes huge amounts of nutrients to show up in lakes and the mouths of rivers. This is what's known as cultural eutrophication. And these nutrient overload produces huge algal blooms and bacteria overgrowth, which is going to end up depleting the available oxygen and often kills off fish and marine organisms in the bottom waters. This creates what are known as dead zones. And if you've ever seen something like this, you probably know what I'm talking about. Okay. Now, the past couple of years, this one's a little different. We haven't seen as much of it this year. COVID's had an interesting effect on the world. some cases positive effects when we start looking at the overall health and well-being of the planet. But you may have gone to, I don't know, Fern Ridge or Cottage Grove Lake, and you've had these warnings of blue-green algae. Blue-green algae can be toxic to any organism that swallows it. And so a lot of us like to take our pets to these areas, but if your dog goes swimming, if your dog's anything like my dogs, they kind of as they're swimming, and they're going to ingest some of that, which can make them very sick or cause them to be very ill. And so we got to avoid getting into areas where have blue-green algae in particular, but just algae in general like that is not healthy for the waterway or the other organisms that live in that area. So we have to try and deal with it before it gets to that point, which again, prevention better than cleanup. So dilution in these cases, unlike in the rivers, is less effective than we see with streams. Why? Because we have stratification, there are different layers. And the movement is really slow because it's a lake or a standing body. So, as such, lakes are much more vulnerable to pollution than streams are. So, we have this process known as eutrophication, which is a natural aging process of a lake over time. But we have to be careful about causing problems in that eutrophication because of overnutrientation. Is that a word? Nutrientation? Overnutriating um, the waters, which can cause the growth of those algal blooms. We also have oligotrophic, which is a relatively low in plant nutrients and containing an abundance of oxygen in the very deep parts, which makes it hard for most of the species that like those areas to survive. So we have cultural eutrophication. It's typically going to be things like nitrates and phosphate containing effluents. Effluents are those runoff pieces that we see typically from agriculture. Leads to dense colonies of plants and algae, especially non-natives and those that are tolerant to such conditions, and rises in cyanobacteria. This can lead to die-off of fish and other animals, prevented, and it can be prevented by limiting phosphate and nitrate use, especially in agriculture, near rivers or other bodies of water, and especially where the steeper slopes make it more likely that you'll get runoff into those bodies of water. Now, like the rivers, however, they can be cleaned and they can recover. It's just a lot harder. Okay. So when you see those effluents, liquid waste, sewage discharge, these types of things coming out into a river or into a sea, you're looking at a pretty big problem that can cause die off, that can cause these dead zones that we're talking about here in a second. And it's not just in terms of surface water. When we talk about rivers, lakes, streams, we're talking mostly about surface water, but this can also happen in groundwater. And unlike the surface water, which even lakes and reservoirs have some flow to them, groundwater cannot clean itself of degradable wastes as quickly. Why? Because it really doesn't flow. And so contaminated or polluted groundwater can take thousands of years to clean itself very slowly of degradable wastes. Part of this is that groundwater has lower concentrations of oxygen and smaller populations of these decomposing bacteria, which means those pollutants sit there longer. They also tend to have colder temperatures, which are going to slow down the rate of chemical reactions that break down those pollutants. And so we have a much longer time scale for natural cleaning in groundwater than we do in lakes. Lakes have a longer cleaning time than rivers and streams. So flow has a big impact on how quickly a body of water can clean itself. So this can be, in some cases, degradable waste, things like organic matter gets washed out. But it can also be slowly degrading waste, things like DDT, if you remember our reading of Silent Spring, that opening chapter from Rachel Carson at the beginning of the term. And then we have our non-degradable wastes, things like lead, arsenic. These are the things we worry about in terms of biomagnification, although we worry about that with DDT too, and becoming toxic in levels at the higher predatory status, third, fourth, fifth step up the food chain. While we are starting to get a pretty good understanding of the impact of surface water pollution, because we can see a lot of it, we really don't know much about the global scale of groundwater pollution. When you're thinking about these aquifers, the underground water, it's very difficult and expensive to go ahead and monitor. And what we're finding is that we are getting these pollutions for things like underground fuel tank leakage, radioactive waste that was buried in the desert that's getting into the water table, development of arsenic levels that are unsafe. So remember that groundwater feeds freshwater and freshwater feeds groundwater. And so contaminating one contaminates the other. And groundwater, as we've seen, is very, very slow to go ahead and self cleanse. So, really, there is not a treatment option that works well here. It's all about prevention, 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 because this is not only the best, but also the least expensive example of keeping our groundwater clean. So, where do we get these pollution that leads to the groundwater? Well, pesticides and fertilizers from fields. You get polluted air when it rains. It's going to bring some of those pollutants down into the water that's taken up by trees and land. We inject hazardous wastes into wells, which can get discharged in. Maybe this is from fracking. Maybe this is from um, other processes. We have septic tanks from people's houses or businesses. We have buried gasoline and solvent tanks, ones that are no longer in use. Sewage transfer, especially if there's a flood and you get runoff from settling ponds or something like that. Wells, if a well gets damaged, you can easily go ahead and get that in. Landfills, accidental spills, right? We dump oil by mistake from changing our car oil and it gets into the waterway by going down the gutter into the drains. Waste lagoons, right? Remember those CAFOs we talked about? CAFOs can have these big sewage ponds, right? The manure lagoons. If a big rainstorm or something like that happens, it's a huge problem. Runoff from coal mines or other strip mining operations that get into the waterway, de-icing roads with salt, things like this. So there's a lot of things we can start looking at. And this illustration here just represents kind of the main sources in the US. But what sources shown here might affect groundwater in our area? I hope you'll stop and think about where you've seen examples of this and how we could potentially eliminate or at least limit the amount of groundwater pollution that comes from these sources. So let's finish by taking a quick look at some solutions. One, we need to go ahead and focus again on prevention, 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 much better than cleanup. So find substitutes for toxic chemicals. If we have to use toxic chemicals, try and keep them out of the environment as much as possible. Let's go ahead and install monitoring wells near landfills or underground tanks to help us get warning before things end up in the waterways. We need some leak detectors on our underground tanks so that if one of these underground fuel storage uh, tanks ends up leaking, we know about it. Okay. And then we can kind of track that water to prevent it from getting into water supplies. We could ban hazardous waste disposal landfills and injected wells. Okay, so know what's going to the landfill. If that's something that they say you shouldn't throw it out, you shouldn't throw it out because it's causing contamination. Store harmful liquids in above ground tanks with leak detection and collection system. And if we're not able to do those things, we can't prevent all of those different sources from getting into nature, then we have to deal with cleanup. Pump to surface the water, clean it, and then return it back to the aquifer is probably the best thing we can do. But that's incredibly expensive. Uses a lot of energy. And where does that energy come from? Well, maybe fossil fuels, which has its own problems or downsides. We can try inject microorganisms to clean up the contamination. This is less expensive, but still expensive. And this is one of the things that they utilize to clean up oil spills. They have some oil eating bacteria, but you're introducing a new species into the wild. So that's got its own downsides. And we can pump nanoparticles of inorganic compounds to remove pollutants. This is still something being developed and is not currently in widespread use. So again, I just can't overemphasize preventable is preferable to cleanup and far more effective. So what can you do? When we start thinking about this, we need to prevent groundwater contamination by reducing non-point runoff. If you work on a farm or know somebody who does, think about how often we use pesticides or fertilizer and how much and what time of year, and are we on a slope down towards a drainage that goes into a particular watershed. Find substitutes whenever possible for toxic pollutants. Now, I can't say I'm perfect here either. When I used to live in Cresswell, one of the things that was a problem, we had a lot of these really big blackberries. You could dig down 3, 4 feet and rip out the roots, they'd still come back. And so everybody told us, well, the only way to deal with it is to use crossbow. But if you read the label for crossbow, it will tell you on there, do not use within 1,000 yards of a waterway. 1,000 yards. Think about a football field. That's 100 yards, right? So 10 times that distance, and don't use crossbow within that distance to a waterway. That's insane. Work with nature to try and treat our sewage. Do those 3 R's that you've been learning since you were in elementary school: reduce, reuse, recycle. If we do that, we can go ahead and limit the amount of waste that we put into the air as well as into the water. And eventually, those are going to connect through the water cycle. Okay. Reduce poverty. People who are worried about their next meal, their next bed, are not going to care about keeping the planet safe when they're just worrying about keeping themselves going and surviving. So, in order to reduce the amount of poverty, we need to slow population growth, and we need to go ahead and think about getting people out of poverty. Those may seem like big things for you to try and do, right? You're still in high school. So, what are some things you can do right now that could help make a difference in some of these? One, when you fertilize garden and yard plants, try and use manure or compost. Try using that instead of these commercial inorganic fertilizers. um, Less runoff, more organic waste, and again, reduce, reuse, recycle. You're reusing to get some benefit. Minimize the use of pesticides, especially near bodies of water. Think about our example of crossbow. Prevent yard waste from entering storm drains. Those storm drains, remember, run into our waterways, which ends up being our drinking water. Don't use toilet fresheners in toilets. Okay. I know it's tempting to, oh, we want it to smell great. Try and leave it as natural as you can. Breaks down easier when we get to the other end as sewage treatment plants. And then there's less risk of getting those things into our waterways. Don't flush unwanted medicines down the toilet. The chemical reactions of what that can do with different plant and animal species, it's just not the best plan. There are places when you can go ahead and take those medicines and they will go ahead and collect them. Talk to your pharmacist. Most places have a plan for that. And lastly, do not pour pesticides, paints, solvents, oil, antifreeze, or any other products containing harmful chemicals down the drain or onto the ground. You're looking at getting them into groundwater and runoff. Okay. All right. That's what I've got for you guys. Stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye bye.